Thanks for coming to our session. I figured that we would just not assume the audience knows every single thing about helium. So hello? Okay. So why don't we just start with kind of a basic question around what problem it is that you were trying to solve when you set out to build helium and how you felt helium would resolve that.
Yeah, in the initial version of helium, or the version that I think we have now, was really aimed at trying to build a ubiquitous IoT network. Like, how would you build like a network that was literally everywhere for IoT devices, which are things like sensors and tracking devices, and it's difficult. It's a difficult problem to solve in a traditional way, right? Like, we've seen big telcos really struggle with deploying IoT networks because the cost is just, quite frankly, too high to build the network, which means that the cost to use the network for the users is too high. So we wanted to figure out like how to deploy a network in a slightly different way, right? Where there weren't billions of dollars of cost like absorbed by a single entity. Because the downside there is, as I mentioned, like you have to pass that cost on to users, right? And so companies that are building like precision agriculture applications or logistics applications, tracking packages, it can't cost $20 a month, right? Like it in a lot of cases, customers want to spend like $1 a year or something, right? So you need a very different way of building the network. And building this crypto economic model was, to me, like a really interesting way of like distributing ownership of the network, right? In the same way that I think of Airbnb as having distributed hospitality to people and Uber having distributed transportation to people. Helium is the first time, I think, that the general public can participate in the telecom industry, right?
Yeah,
Which is
but actually, let's back up, because before you introduced the crypto token, you struggled a little bit, and then that sort of solved a problem for you. So can you talk about that moment?
Yeah, I mean, we struggled for years. We launched in 2013, actually July 4th it was, and we didn't really know how to solve the problem. Like we had a lot of ideas on how we might do this differently. A lot of them were actually similar to what we ended up doing, but we didn't have the right economic structure. Right? Like we didn't want to build the network. We knew it was going to be too expensive, and we would just be like a low budget version of AT&T or something, right? And so we didn't really want to do it that way. And so we struggled with all sorts of different approaches. Like we tried to make it sort of developer first and sort of hope that developers would build the network. We hoped that customers would, partially build the network. It wasn't really until probably 2017 that we started paying attention to crypto in any meaningful way, which is sort of embarrassing. It took us that long to figure out that crypto was a thing.
You were still early.
Yeah. Well, it's still very early, right? But it didn't feel like it at the time. But yeah, even back in like 2013 or 14, I think Mark Phillips, who runs business development for us, who's here somewhere, we were joking that we should put ASIC, miners inside hotspots, right, to mine Bitcoin. We didn't really know what that meant at the time. We were like, I don't know if that's even a thing. But then we sort of forgot about it for 2 or 3 years. And for me, when I read the Filecoin white paper, actually was the first time that I had seen someone trying to build a crypto network that was specific to like an application, right? It wasn't just about moving money, or it wasn't esoteric in the way that Ethereum or something was. And it was like, okay, they want to build a file storage network, and this is how they're going to do it. And then it was like a little bit of a light bulb for us. It's like, well, what if we could do the same approximate thing, but for network coverage? And that's kind of how it was born. It was probably sort of towards the end of 2017.
And so once you introduced the token, kind of how did the network behave, or how did participants on the network behave before, and then how did they behave after?
So it was really a big reboot when we started this version of Helium in 2019. As I mentioned a little bit ago, we launched actually here in Austin in 2019. And I think there's 3 types of like participant in Helium. At least this is the way I've come to think of it. There are like crypto enthusiasts, right, who are familiar with mining. Maybe they mine other, crypto protocols. There are IoT enthusiasts, so people who are already involved in IoT that, were working with LoRaWAN or knew about it, or were building sensors or were building applications. And then there's a group that I don't know how to describe them any better than to just call them like telco anarchists, who like, hate telcos, right? And like, and it's an easy one to hate, right? Like, I don't think anyone is particularly like thrilled with the telco industry. So those are kind of the three constituents, and they all behave kind of differently, right? Like the IoT enthusiasts are focused on the developer applications and like how to build, stuff that uses the network. The crypto miners are like purely focused on like mining and ROI and rewards. And the telco anarchists are just, doing their thing. I don't know, but that's, those are, I think, kind of the constituents, and they're all motivated in slightly different ways. But ultimately, everyone gets to participate in like the economics of this, and I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I actually feel like those groups apply to pretty much all the crypto networks. You've got like the speculators, the actual users, and then the people who are kind of like ideological about it. So it's fascinating. It's basically the same here. And so now at this point, you've grown to 1 billion devices. How did you do that? And kind of give us a picture of like where they are and where you still have kind of dead spots, I guess. I'm not sure how to call them.
Yeah, so there are, it's closing in on about 1 million devices globally now.
Oh, sorry.
Hotspots.
I misheard you when we spoke the other day.
Billion sounds better, but
okay.
I wish. Not quite there.
Definitely a difference.
Getting there soon. So someone, I still can't believe that this is accurate, but someone said that 10% of the Earth's population is close to helium coverage now, which I don't know if that's true or not. Don't hold me to it, but it sounds good. And 75% of U.S. zip codes are, have some amount of helium coverage. And so some of that is a function of the technology that we use. So the protocol that we use is called LoRaWAN. It is extremely long range, right? So a single hotspot can create, in some cases, miles and miles of network coverage. But really, it's just, I think it's this excitement around getting to participate in this industry for the first time, right? It's like, you can't get into the telecom industry. There are so many moats, right? There's spectrum, and there's the cost of infrastructure, and there's the complexity of like actually deploying it and using it. And so I think part of what Helium did really, really well was make the user experience of building a network quite simple, right? Like you got a device that wasn't ugly, right? It wasn't like an ASIC miner, which is kind of like a shoebox of wires, right? It was kind of decent looking, and you set it up with a phone app in the same way that you would a consumer electronic device. And I think making it easy to use is a critical like innovation there, right? Like because it opens it to a much broader audience. And I think crypto in general still has a lot of work to do in terms of like closing that gap. It's still wildly complicated and confusing for the most part. So I think Helium did that well, and it's a big part of why the network has been able to like grow and expand and reach so many different people.
And so it sounds like there's quite a concentration in the US.
I actually don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there are about 65,000 cities and 170 countries, I think is the approximate number. So I actually don't know the percentages, but it's definitely, we started in the US, like we were US centric for a while. But we now have like all sorts of different vendors that are manufacturing hotspots in different regions of the world. And so it's very global now, but I actually don't know the distribution percentages.
And so you started with the Internet of Things. Can you talk a little bit about who it is that began using Helium for that purpose and kind of what that usage looks like?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenging things with the IoT space is it's different from something like cellular, right? Like with cellular, like there is a use case, right, which is phones, like for the most part, right? And with IoT, it is not like that. Like the use cases are just literally everything, right? Like anything you could think of, right? And so the breadth of applications are both impressive, but also a challenge, right? Because it's difficult to focus on any one particular thing and say like, okay, that's where we should be spending all of our business development energy or something, right? It doesn't really work that way. And so it's everything from precision agriculture, which is the whole industry of how do we make farming more efficient, basically, right? Using data and sensors, to logistics, like how do I track packages and know where everything is all the time, and to God, there's a drone delivery company that I just mentioned, which is one of my favorite, where they're actually delivering packages using drones. So it's very, very broad. I think Salesforce is using it to track employee badges. So it's all over the place. Like you couldn't even look at a single use case and say like that's the one, right? Like you can in cellular, for example, which is both a strength and a challenge at the same time.
I have to say, the Salesforce thing sounds a little creepy.
Yeah, I mean, all of it's a little creepy. You know, they've got like sensors everywhere, right? And
It's like one of those like tags on you, you know, that you put on an animal, or I don't know. But anyway, hopefully they're
I won't speak to Salesforce's HR policies. I don't know.
So now let's talk about some new initiatives that you have. You're going to be adding new networks. Talk about what those networks are and why you decided to add them. And something interesting to me is that you're going to have tokens for each of them. So I'm curious about why you decided to go that route as well.
It was really demand driven is the way I like to think of it, right? We were very focused on IoT. We've spent so long in that industry that I don't want to say expert, like I never feel comfortable saying we're experts in something, but we know a lot about IoT. And so there's still a lot of work to do there, right? Like we aren't finished by any means. It was really the FreedomFi team. So FreedomFi is a company based in the Bay Area also that was building open source cellular networks, right? Like their vision is effectively to be sort of the Linux or Red Hat of cellular networking. Today, like that industry is dominated really by three players, like Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei are the companies that build base station infrastructure for all the telcos. And the vision there was like, okay, maybe just like you did in the enterprise server market, where it used to be dominated by like Sun and HP and Microsoft, and eventually kind of got blown up by open source Linux. Maybe the same thing could happen in the telco industry for cellular, right? Which is that the infrastructure could get much cheaper and much simpler and be much more broadly available globally. And so they discovered Helium at some point in their journey, right? Like, and realized that Helium was an interesting way of accelerating that vision. And so that was really how we got introduced to it. We had always toyed with the idea. Even in our original white paper back in 2018, like, you know, there's a section there where we talked about, like, we would like to figure out if we could do the same thing in 5G or cellular or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or any other type of network. So it wasn't a new idea. I just don't think we knew exactly how to do it, right? Like we were still so focused on IoT. And then the FreedomFi team had done so much work already on how to do that. And so it sort of became a natural thing. It's like, okay, well, how would we fit cellular into the network, right? Because you've got like this token supply and so much of it has already gone to the IoT network. And how would you incentivize the creation of the 5G network the same way, right? And that's how this idea of like multiple tokens was born, sort of thinking about Helium as like an L1 and an L2 in the same way that like Ethereum has ETH and L2 tokens are, you know, on top. That was kind of the idea, and that was sort of the vision behind it.
Oh, does that mean that with existing Helium devices, you can just add 5G to your existing device, or do you need a separate device? Or
it will probably be possible to do some of that, right? So I know, I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to talk about it, but one of the vendors is thinking about doing that, making an add-on device for their existing hotspots that makes it possible to turn their existing IoT device into a cellular-ready device. But for the most part, you'll be buying new hardware that does a different thing.
And how do you encourage people kind of in those dead areas to I guess, spin up devices? Because I imagine like cities probably have much more coverage simply because there's more people there.
Yeah, so I don't think we've done this perfectly by any means, but we came up with this idea called proof of coverage, which, you know, tries to verify whether coverage exists in a place, right? It's like one of the most difficult blockchain problems is this sort of like Oracle problem, as they describe it, right? Like, how do you get data from the outside world into the blockchain and know that it's true, right? And the simplest example was always the weather, for example, right? Like, how would you know that it's like 72 degrees in San Francisco, like, and be able to verify that and prove that it's true, like,
or 100 degrees in Austin,
or 100 degrees in Austin with 80% humidity or whatever it is. So part of the proof of coverage idea, and this was a community proposal like several years ago, was to try and increase the rewards for areas that were less dense, basically, right? So basically trying to use economics to motivate people to do the right thing. It works reasonably well, but you still have this situation where there are like 4,000 hotspots in like Manhattan or something, right? And it's, you know, so it isn't, people live where they live to some degree, right? And so some of the journey is just reaching more people, right? Like is reaching people that are in those rural areas. I think with 5G and with cellular, it's going to be quite different from IoT because the user can also consume their own network, right? In IoT, like a lot of the applications are still B2B type applications, right? They're industrial or they're commercial in some way. There are still very few consumer-focused IoT applications. So I think the people building the IoT network don't necessarily get to use it, right? Like it's for someone else. And with 5G, it's going to be very different to that, right? Like the people building the network may also use the network, right? And so people in rural areas, in dead spots who don't have good coverage from an existing telco might be, inspired to try this because it's a way to like build networks in their community or for themselves. And so I think the dynamics there with 5G versus IoT are going to be quite different.
And so when you kind of project your vision out for when this network kind of has, a decent amount of coverage and there really is a 5G network, I guess, or a cellular network that you can mostly rely on, what does that look like? Like you were saying, maybe it would bring costs down, because I personally don't really know what it means to have an open source cellular network. Does it mean that I won't have a mobile, what's the word? I won't like pay AT&T every month, or kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly what we would like to end up happening, right? Is that we know of at least one entity building a carrier on top of Helium 5G, and I think that's super exciting. And so you might subscribe directly to them, right? And rather than use AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon or whatever, you may be a customer of a carrier that lives on the network, right? And I expect there to be a bunch of different benefits for doing that. One is definitely cost, right? Like you can probably bring the cost of using the network down to fractions of what it costs today, just like in IoT, the cost of deploying the infrastructure is so much cheaper than the traditional way of doing it. I think there are going to be other benefits depending on what it is that people care about, right? Like it's going to be much more private in nature. There won't be an entity selling your data to someone else, right? Like, so, and they'll be harder to like do SIM swap attacks, and like so it sort of depends on. I think it will depend on the segment. Like for some people, price is going to be the main driver. For other people, like for me, privacy would be the main driver. For other people, security would be the main driver. So there's lots of different ways of looking at it. But ultimately, like this is infrastructure that anyone can use, including the carriers, right? So like we have constantly been in talks with all of the major carriers. I think Freedom Fi announced that 2 of the 3 big US carriers are already testing on the Helium 5G network to use it as a offload network for themselves. So there's going to be lots of different ways that the network gets consumed, whether you know it or not.
And what does that mean, offload network? Is that like when there's peak demand or something, they have this kind of backup resource, or
something like that? It sort of depends on the situation. And I always use the example of airports as being a good one, right? Like if you go into an airport, particularly in the United States, the cell carriers don't actually own those networks, right? So if I'm an AT&T customer and I go into SFO Airport, it's still going to say AT&T in the corner, and it's going to look like I have 5 bars, but I'm actually using someone else's network. Like it might be run by Boingo, it might be run by someone else, and Boingo has a relationship with AT&T that is sort of passing data back and forth. And increasingly, wireless networks are built this way, right? Like often they are owned by multiple parties. And AT&T is sort of the subscriber face, or T-Mobile is the subscriber face. But in the back end, it's actually a network of networks, for want of a better word. And so you could imagine Helium 5G being like that. It would be one of the players in that ecosystem. And AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon may choose to use the Helium network for a bunch of different reasons. There may be coverage in areas where they don't have coverage. It may be cheaper than what they're paying someone like Boingo to use the network. So it may be congestion, right? Like their main macro network may be too busy or too crowded, and you can think of it, especially for events. Like if you go to the conference center to try and go to Consensus, like the cell phone service there is atrocious, right? Because you've got 5 bars, but nothing works because there's just so much traffic on the network. And so there are going to be lots and lots of different situations, I think, where it is interesting to the carriers to like use a network like Helium to like offload, basically. And that's the sort of industry term for that.
Something that was interesting to me was earlier when you were describing the open source cellular networks, you were saying basically that people would still interface with companies on the network, that it wasn't kind of something, truly decentralized where maybe people might pay with tokens directly or something. So, why is it that there would still be centralized companies that they would interface with?
I think you could do it either way. Like you could do it that way, right? Where you interface directly with the network. We have that on the IoT network today. There's sort of like centralized entities that make it easier for companies to get to use the network. And some of the reason for that is, like some of these big corporations don't want to hold tokens. Like sometimes they can't hold tokens for like legal reasons. So sometimes it is necessary for there to be an interface somehow, right? And I think what's important is making it possible for like multiple entities to be the interface, right? Like we don't have to be the interface on the IoT network, for example. Like there are several providers that make it possible. If you didn't want to do it directly on chain and you didn't want to hold tokens and you would rather use a credit card, for example, like there are entities that will help you do that. And so to me, it's important that it isn't just us. Like sometimes customers are added to the network. We have no idea who they are. We don't even know they exist. And that's great, right? Like it's perfect to do it that way. So I think there will always be multiple paths that you can choose. And if you are a miner, for example, and you have a bunch of tokens, there's going to be a way for you to just use the tokens to consume the network directly. It's going to be more sort of, prosumer focused that way, right? Like only a certain group of people are going to do that. Others are going to be just like, I want to, just give you my credit card basically and like treat it as if it was AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon. So as long as I think there's options, I think it's okay that there are centralized entities that sit there, arguably in the same way that you have you have fiat on and off ramps in crypto in general, right? Like you need a Coinbase or you need an FTX or you need someone to like be the interface to get in and out of the ecosystem. And so it's similar to that, but I think a little bit more open.
And actually, we kind of touched on this question of why you would have a separate token for each of these new networks that you're building, but why is that? Why is that necessary?
I think a few different reasons. I mean, one of them is to think about governance, right? Like the way the networks work is going to be very, very different from each other, right? And as an example, like the cost of using the cellular network should be completely different from the cost of using the IoT network. Right, and as an example, I think using the IoT network is about $400 a gigabyte, right? In cellular land, that's absurd, right? Like you just could never pay that, right? And so in the 5G network, it's 50 cents a gigabyte, right? And so there are going to be these very different considerations, and the way the proof of coverage protocol works is going to be completely different from network to network. So one of them is to try and encourage governance of each protocol to like be in the hands of the people actually like building those networks, right? So if you are building the IoT network and you are a holder of the IoT token, like you are the one with governance rights for that token, right? Not HNT holders, like IoT holders, right? And the same for 5G, that will be called the mobile token. And so part of it is that. Part of it is this sort of notion of like unit bias, right? So there was an improvement proposal maybe about a year ago that suggested redenominating HNT, right? So that one HNT would become 1,000 HNT. And part of that is miners don't like earning 0.05 HNT a day or whatever the average is, right? They would rather have 50 or 500. And we aren't the only network to have like struggled with this. Like Polkadot did this, a while ago. They redenominated and they added, like 4 zeros to the end of their, to their token. And so some of it is that, right? Like having this sort of redenomination. And some of it is just to allow the economies to exist on their own. Like people might, speculators or investors in those networks, I think want to speculate in different ways depending on what the network is, or they might have different desires or different visions for how this is going to go. And so having separate tokens allows for all of that activity, but still accrues value back to HNT, and sort of like HNT is sort of the reserve currency, kind of like gold in the sort of US dollar analogy, but like back in the 70s.
So in terms of the cellular network, I just imagine there's going to be a lot more challenges in growing that, simply because, as we mentioned, there's so much more demand for cellular, packets. I'm not sure what the terminology is. So how do you imagine overcoming that? Because I do think probably the Internet of Things network is just a lot easier to build because there's not as much demand. So
it's easier in a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, the range of the IoT network devices is much larger, right? And so there's in radio frequency technology, you're like always trading range for bandwidth, basically, right? So you can make the bandwidth extremely small, right? So that you can only send, tiny bits of data, and you get longer range out of that. In the cellular applications, it's the opposite of that, right? The bandwidth is very wide, but the range is relatively tiny. So you're going to have a different type of challenge, right? Like you're going to need many more devices, devices being hotspots, in order to create like reasonably useful coverage networks. The flip side of that is there's so much more demand, right? So arguably there's more economic incentive to set up more devices, because there's going to be a lot of phones using those networks, right? And so it's different from the IoT network, which is, I think, still searching for applications, right? Like there's, 5 or 10 year like lead time basically for IoT to get big, as far as I'm concerned. And there's one example of a company using this network called NanoThings that has built this tracking device that's like a sticker. And they started before we did, right? And they're only now, like getting their product to market in like a meaningful way. And so that's how long it takes to like go from an idea to like an actual product. And so everyone kind of has to be aware of that, right? Like IoT is on a long, long timeline, and that's okay. But cellular is going to be very different. You're going to require many more devices, as you're saying. Like the demand is so much higher for bandwidth. The range is so much worse on the device side. But at the same time, the economic incentive is very different, right? Like they're going to be like real data consumption on the network. And that's ultimately where I think Helium and HNT as a token needs to be, which is ideally like decoupled from the very speculative nature of the crypto markets, right? Like it shouldn't be that when Bitcoin goes down 3%, HNT goes down 10% or something, right? Like we want to like try and get rid of that coupling so that demand for HNT is primarily driven by usage rather than speculation.
All right, well, what future kind of milestones or, challenges are you looking forward to as you move forward with Helium?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit earlier, like the mobile token launches in a few weeks. And so that's kind of the first major milestone, which is that anyone that owns a 5G hotspot will start to earn mobile tokens. So definitely a good time to start getting involved with that. And then, there's a lot of like implementation steps required in order to like get to the sort of fullness of a network of networks kind of idea. So I think it will realistically probably take us until the end of the year until all of that is finished. And so that's exciting work. And then I'm excited to see what people do with the network, like as it grows, right? Like, and we already know about some of the things that are coming, and it will be exciting to announce some of those partnerships and some of those deals. This work that we're doing as Nova Labs as a company, which we'll also be announcing, which I think is also really exciting. So we have our hands full for the foreseeable future, but it's all to me like incredibly exciting and an amazing journey.
And what have I not asked you that you would want this audience to know?
I'm shilling again, but people should buy hotspots while they're here because they are heavily discounted while everyone's here. So go do that upstairs and downstairs. Yeah, and like I said, I couldn't be more excited about where Helium is and where Helium is going, and so and I'm continue to be thankful for the community that has joined us on this journey and is really responsible for all of the growth.
Great, yeah, I have to say, for those of you who read a lot of crypto coverage in the mainstream media, the New York Times generally, I mean, I wouldn't say that everything they write is negative, but like they're a newspaper, so they're going to cover problems. And one of the few positive articles I read on crypto in the New York Times was about Helium. So there you have it. I think that says something. But yeah, I really enjoyed this discussion. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura.